Hello, and we're going to have a series of short tutorials to acquaint you with the IRB process. If at any time you can contact me or whoever becomes the next chair for questions regarding any specifics, but the goal of these tutorials is just to give you an overview of the process used at the NSU IRB. So this first set of tutorials is going to walk you through the application itself. As a reviewer, you will receive applications and be asked to review them. And so I want to point out what it is exactly that you'll be looking for when you look at these applications. I've divided the applications up into chunks covering parts of the application. And when I send back comments to the investigators, I reference specific parts that need to be modified according to what the board says. And so this first video is going to look at parts 1 through 3 of the application. These are pretty straightforward parts. So just to give you an idea, this is the application as it is. When I receive them, I actually input the number and keep track of the applications on an Excel spreadsheet. I also quickly look over them and I judge whether they're an exempt, an expedited, or a full board review application. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. So those are things that I will do before I send them to you. And once you get them, the things that you're going to be looking for. Number one, we're obviously looking for the project title. This will be here, and it will also be in the consent form. Most applications will have a consent form, and so we want to make sure that those project titles match. And I will add that all your emails with specific reference to applications will start with the application number in the heading. Okay. So in part 1, what we're looking for are the researchers. Most of the time we have students as principal investigators and then a faculty sponsor. Sometimes we have, well, quite a few times actually, we have faculty doing research, and so they will be the primary investigator. And you can quickly see just by looking at the investigator status if it's a student or if it's a faculty member. If it's a student, we have to have a faculty advisor also represented on the application. So we will typically send those back and ask them to complete that and copy their advisors on the submission. Sometimes we have multiple investigators, and if so, we just ask them to continue to copy and paste this section. So that's part 1, and pretty straightforward. Part 2 is funding. Typically we only look at funding, well, I won't say only, but primary reason we look at funding here is to see how things are going to be paid for. Specifically, if they're going to offer some type of reward, like a gift certificate, that kind of stuff, we want to see how it's going to be paid for. Most research does not require any funding, and so this is typically left as NA. But sometimes it does, especially some faculty research dealing with large grants. We will see that they come through as part of a grant application, and sometimes there's a little bit different process done when we see the grant attached, and we'll ask for a copy of that application. And finally, part 3, the administrative data. So this is important for us to see the proposed start date. Most of the time they click upon IRB approval. Sometimes when I see a specific start date, it's listed though, and I know that the process will not be complete. I inform the investigators that we will not meet that date, and they cannot collect data for this study until they gain IRB approval. We want to see what kind of project is being done, and there's a range of all those projects there. We want to see if there will be medical screening involved. Sometimes there are applications that involve some type of physical activity or so forth, or if research says that this study may involve a process that could raise your blood pressure or something like that. After reviewing it, we want to see if there's a medical screening of some sort involved. A lot of times we'll get applications from H&K that deal with physical activity, and we want to see some type of medical screening sometime. So if there is, we simply ask them to explain what that medical screening is. On study sites, part 3-4 here, most of our research is done at NSU, as you will see, on the various campuses. If there's a research done at another institution, it's my job as the chair to ensure that we gain site permission from that other institution. And so we will note that, or I will note that in my comments, and as a result of that, I will not send out final approval until we gain site permission. And so if it gets to that point where we're ready to send final approval and we don't have site permission, then I will notify the investigators that we're waiting on site permission before I send any more feedback. The potentially vulnerable populations, this is one of the key areas we look at to decide whether the review is going to be an exempt, an expedited, or a full board review. And let's take a look at those categories real fast. Here we have landed on the IRB homepage at NSU, and to get an idea of the categories, you can go to policies and procedures, and everything is outlined here, but we're going to look at categories for IRB review. And basically, there's a detailed explanation here of the 3 categories, and I'm going to give you a cursory summary of them. In the exempt category, the most common thing that we see, if we can scroll down a little bit, are these areas right here. Research conducted in educational settings involving normal educational practices, research using educational tests, surveys, interviews, or observations of public behavior, or secondary use of existing data. Data collected by anyone before the proposed study for some other purpose. Typically what we see when we deal with exempt categories by far are a collection of data that's already out there, and that will fall under the category of exempt. Expedited reviews are basically reviews that involve participants, and so it becomes expedited. But the categories of the participants is not one of these categories. When we see one of these special categories pop up, then we put it to a full board review, and that is children under 18 years of age, pregnant women, the elderly, psychologically impaired, cognitively impaired, prisoners, or Native Americans, or students enrolled in a class in which the instructor is an investigator. And the reason that we look at the students enrolled in class and call that a full board review is because we want to make sure there are processes in place so that the students don't feel coerced to participate in the study. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on. If the applicant is using a population that may contain pregnant women or elderly people or even Native Americans in general, but that is not the purpose of the study. In other words, let's say they want to do a random sampling on the street in Tahlequah, and based upon the demographics, there's a chance that they may interview Native Americans, and so they click that Native Americans are involved. We will look at that and indicate that this is not full board for that reason, simply because Native Americans are not the target of the research. So it may be collateral piece of the research, but it's not the target, and so therefore it is not considered protected in that sense. Okay, so, and if any of these categories are highlighted, then it automatically becomes a full board review. And we'll see a little bit more on this in another part of the application. And two more areas down here. The first one is institutional oversight. The most common institution we share oversight with is the Cherokee Nation. That's why they're listed on here. And secondary to that would be universities, where we have faculty doing PhD research, and or we have faculty teaming up as part of a team from another institution, and the research is actually being done at the other institution. When those cases come through, what I do is I review the application, and common practice for us would be to take what we call a secondary role, and we will give oversight to the other institution, and we will follow their policies. But that doesn't mean that we're going to just blanket agreement to the application. Sometimes we will ask for additional information, even though we're taking a secondary oversight role. We don't have too many of those, but we have a few every year. And then finally, the last one is simply a conflict of interest statement. Okay, and so that takes us through the first three parts of the application. Part 4 deals with the actual research, and that's a little bit more, so we'll spend the next video looking at just part 4.